And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great to have back on Aaron Renn for another discussion about life in the negative world. Aaron, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
So, podcast listeners have been with us for a long time may remember a great discussion with Aaron a little while back about the article at the time that he had written about the negative world and kind of these three different worlds. And so many Christians, I think, are experiencing, hey, we're living in a different environment, we're living in a different culture. And since that interview, Aaron turned that into a book, and it's been just encouraging to see that model being expressed elsewhere. And I think for all of us answering that question, what do we do next? How do we live faithfully? How do we live courageously in the negative world? That's what we want to dive into today. So buckle up. We're going to cover a lot of ground here. If you're unfamiliar with Aaron's work, Aaron was a writer and consultant in Indianapolis. He's a co-founder, senior fellow previously at the American Reformer. He's also the author of the book Life in the Negative World. He had a career in management and technology, had a second career in urban policy as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and his work has appeared in a number of leading global publications, including The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and others, frequently cited in many publications around the world. So I encourage you to sign up for his Substack. I find it so encouraging. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. Aaron, if you wouldn't mind, just jump in if I missed anything about your background and kind of what you're working on currently, and if you had just a recent highlight from your work as we get started.
Sure. Just doing mostly writing across all the various platforms and institutions that I'm associated with. Again, you can find it all at my Substack, aaronrenn.com. And, just continuing, I did an interview with Al Mohler, I guess, on his podcast, Thinking in Public, that I thought was a really good exposition of some of my work. So that was one highlight that I had. Also had a very nice review of my book, Life in the Negative World, by the pastor Kevin DeYoung in First Things Magazine, which was great. So, yeah, I'm keeping super busy. There's no doubt about that.
Certainly a lot to write on, and I was really encouraged. I enjoyed the Mohler episode, Thinking in Public. We'll have a link to that as well. We'll find DeYoung's article too. But yeah, just encouraged to see that your insight, and I think you're faithful. We need to be prudential, and we need to be wise in how we move forward. I really appreciate that encouragement, but also just realize, hey, we're living in this time, and we got to stand up for truth. So I appreciate that mix and the wisdom that you bring. Well, why don't we dive right in just briefly for those that perhaps may not be familiar with the article or the book. What is the positive world? And you have this three-world analysis: positive world, neutral world, negative world. So briefly, what's the positive world, and kind of what basic time frame? I know we're talking in generalities. When did the U.S. transition to that neutral world?
Yeah, well, let me give you just a brief overview of the model. So we never had a state church like in Europe, but for most of American history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So as recently as the 1950s, half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible readings in our public schools in the 1950s. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money, "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. So it was, in a sense, a sort of, again, generically Christian normative society, if you will. This began to become unraveled in the 1960s, and the status of Christianity in America went into a decline that continues to the present day. And I divide this period of decline from roughly 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear, it's a period of decline for Christianity. All is not going well. Church attendance is down, for example. And yet Christianity is still basically viewed positively by society. To be viewed as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian morality are still the basic moral system of the country. And if you violate it, you could even get into trouble. 1994, we had a tipping point into what I call the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014. And in the neutral world, Christianity's not really seen positive anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. and Christian moral system sort of has a residual, hold on society, you may say. Then in 2014, we had a second tipping point into what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, sort of official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically, might be a better way to put it. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite sectors of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated, and in many respects, people now see, conservative Christians in some respects as the leading new threat to the new public moral order. And I think this has been a very dislocating shift into this negative world for American Christians who are still trying to figure out how to live in it.
So just interesting lived experience. So I can't remember if it was Muller's episode or perhaps another podcast I was listening to, but just as kind of one indicator of that positive world, that to obtain a home loan or a business loan in a lot of places in this kind of positive world, 60s, 70s, included in the personal financial records that you would provide would be a letter from your pastor that you're a good, church attending man, or church attending person.
I don't think I've heard that one. So you may have heard that from someone else.
Okay. So I was trying to remember where that was sourced from, but as one indicator that, hey, you're an upstanding person, you're well recognized by society, and as proof of that, you attend church on Sunday somewhere. And then kind of lived experience for me growing up in 1990s and into the 2000s as I went on to college, just generally, I think Christianity was viewed as the hard but right choice. So maybe it's difficult to follow the biblical sexual ethic, et cetera, but generally positive. And then I came out of law school, and when I kind of realized, wow, the world has changed, I was actually standing in front of the United States Supreme Court. And if you remember the case that overthrew the Defense of Marriage Act, be the Windsor case, I went to attend the oral arguments. And I'm standing in line, kind of very familiar with the practice. It's kind of like Black Friday, if you've ever gone Black Friday shopping and everybody waits in front. Sometimes people even camp there. And I'm standing there, generally for a biblical view of marriage. And a reporter comes up and out of all the people in line, sticks the mic in my face and says, "What do you think about this?" And of course, I shared my my confidence in the biblical view of marriage. And I realized pretty quickly I was one of the very few people in line that was in support of that position. That would have been right there. You mentioned 2014. This has been like 2013. So this has just been kind of my lived experience and why these three worlds just so deeply resonated with me. And so just a couple of reflections on how I experienced that. So how did the church engage in kind of the neutral world? You mentioned the 90s up to 2014. What were some of the strategies that the church employed?
Sure. Well, in my article and book, I highlight three basic strategies that, again, mostly focus on the evangelical church that it deployed, which are basically culture war, seeker sensitivity, and cultural engagement. So culture war, as we know, is the religious right. It got going in the 70s with people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. I always say the very name of the leading culture war organization, Moral Majority, tells you so much about the fact that they were in a positive world. Nobody would ever claim to speak for a moral majority today, Christian. But at least it was. It may not have been true then either, but it was at least a plausible claim there. And so that continues to this day. Of course, the religious right, very combative that we know. Then also in the 70s, we saw the development of secret sensitivity, pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, Rick Warren at Saddleback Church. These folks also saw that Christianity was in decline, church attendance was down, but their response was, why don't we make a church people will attend? And so let's get rid of these stodgy denominational distinctives and old hymns and robes and stuff like that and create like a casual, informal, topical, therapeutic church. This is really the progenitor of the non-denominational suburban megachurch that we all know so well, and is really kind of in many ways the evangelical mainstream today. Tons of that here in Indianapolis.
Sure.
And then the cultural engagement really emerged in the neutral world in the 1990s. And, I think there's a couple ways to think of that. First is as a seeker sensitivity for the cities. As cities started to come back, this sort of, Christianity to reach this new urban class sort of emerged. And you can think of Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York as an example of that. And then it was also, in a sense, the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, they're like, why don't we take advantage of this new kind of pluralistic public square and have conversations with people? And so they were much more positive towards the culture than the old religious right were. And again, all three of these are still with us today. And you could kind of think of them as culture war as kind of, small town rural Christianity, seeker sensitivity, suburban Christianity, and cultural engagement, urban Christianity. Although, of course, that's a big oversimplification, but I do think it kind of gets at a little bit of something there.
It's fascinating. And just looking back even at some of the ways of churches that I've been involved with, movements that I've been involved with, and certainly some interplay among those. So as we move into negative world, you set out, I thought, some very helpful suggestions. And the focus on this podcast is essentially this question: what do we do now? What do we do next? So I wanted to dig into some suggestions. So how does the church live out its mission in the negative world? And one of the pieces I wanted to mention to listeners, one of the reasons I appreciate your approach and your work is that you've spent a lot of work talking about cities. And as I studied the New Testament, the local church just happened to be city-driven, city-focused. And so all of Paul's letters are written to churches in cities. And so we often talk about renewing the United States or renewing America, whereas I think the New Testament, especially specifically the book of Acts, drives us to think more in the lines of our zip code or our city. And then that effort then multiplies to the nation. So you have a couple of suggestions. I want to dive into each of these. The first one was to become resilient. What were your thoughts along those lines?
Sure. So, this isn't even necessarily something that's entirely limited to Christians, but the idea is if you're in a higher pressure world, then you need to be structuring your life to be more resilient in the face of that pressure. And so you can think about things that used to be you didn't have to worry about. Now you have to think about, where do I live? What kind of career do I want to have? How much debt do I want to take on? What kind of lifestyle do I want to be living? And I don't think there's any one answer to all of those questions, but you have to think about it in terms of, resiliency to pressure. So if you are working in a Fortune 500 company and you're mortgaged to the max to live a certain lifestyle, then should something come along that causes your conscience troubles, then you're not going to be in a great position to do anything about it. And so I think those are the sorts of things that people need to be thinking about. And again, this is just something that goes well beyond on the church as well, as we've seen so much economic disruption, blow through the country. Many Indiana communities, of course, have suffered a lot from deindustrialization. I worked in the technology business for, a time, as you noted, and I lived through the mass growth in offshore software development and outsourcing. And how that completely transformed the industry. And so I think this idea of just resiliency in the face of unexpected changes and pressures is just very important to just have in life in general. And, as I talk about in the book, I kind of talk a little bit about the financial aspects of this. But I'm very influenced here by the writer Nassim Taleb, who is most famous for his book, The Black Swan, in which he essentially, in a sense, predicted the financial crash that happened shortly after, his book came out. But he really has some very profound writings around what it means to live in a world where there's a lot of risk and uncertainty. And so a couple books that he wrote that I definitely recommend. One is called Fooled by Randomness, and the other is Anti-Fragile, which talk a lot about, life under uncertainty and risk. That I think is the sort of thing that we ought to be taking into account. Because again, we just live, and again, this isn't even necessarily limited to Christians. How many times has some person been canceled from their job? In Indianapolis, the Jackie Needus, who was the head of the library system, probably the most liberal, mainstream Democratic politician in the city, was basically run out of her job, fired by a mob that called her racist, even though she's the furthest thing from being racist. And so, you're just vulnerable to that stuff today in ways that people were not in the past because there are just so many landmines you can step on. And so many people who would like nothing better than they like to destroy people's lives. They just really enjoy that. I mean, it seems. And so I think everybody ought to be thinking a little bit about, how am I structuring my life in light of this? Not in a fearful way or in a belief that we can, get rid of all risk, but certainly I think, being prudential and being wise and just thinking through, with intentionality, what we want to do.
This is such a powerful recommendation. I think just personally, we all prepare for financial uncertainty, but we need to be thinking about cultural uncertainty. And just what you said about even as you're looking at what job you're going to take, as I'm still teaching students, and I do my best to speak in Christian schools as well, and sometimes get that request, should I feel called to this? Should I pursue it? And I do try to provide that, hey, well, here's some things to think about. Could you actually live out your faith in good conscience in that role? And so don't get yourself involved in that if you don't think you could. And unfortunately, the law needs to change because we should be free to live out our faith. The other aspect of this that I was thinking of while reviewing it is even as an institution. I know you're talking about institutional integrity a little bit later, but even the question of some conservative organizations, even faith-based nonprofits that are having to think about, where do we bank? Where do we get our insurance? What about our CRM? And so we're almost having to create a separate ecosystem so that we can have that resilience. So much more to think through. We'll just leave it right there, but a lot to mull on. And just encourage listeners to think about their own life, their own ministry. Are you culturally resilient as we head further into this negative world? The next one you mentioned is to become excellent. What were you thinking there?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. One, I was inspired by the book, The Scandal, the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll. Came out about 30 years ago. And he's a Notre Dame historian. And he's basically like, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that we don't have one. And that maybe it was a little overstated. But, in fact, the truth is that evangelical churches have not been the intellectual leaders of their own movement. I mean, if you look, if you look at political conservatism, for example, much heavier Catholic representation there than evangelical in terms of the thought leadership. And then also by the book Averages Over by the economist Tyler Cowen, where again, the center, the broad center is sort of getting hollowed out. And, we have people more at the extremes. You're either a winner or a loser. That's not a great society. I wish we'd have a society like that. But that's sort of where we are. And the degree of difficulty dial on life has just been turned up today. When I was in the 80s, growing up in the 80s, it's like, oh, you need to go to college because all the good jobs in the future are going to have college degrees. They're going to be college degree. Manufacturing is sort of going away. And so I went to college, and it really was sort of in the 80s or even the 90s. If you went to college and got a degree and weren't a complete goof, you were probably going to do all right. You were going to get a job. You're going to have a professor. Well, like now having a college degree doesn't necessarily protect you from the winds of change, anymore. And so, think about something like buying a house. Again, I don't know the whole state of Indiana situation, but here in Indianapolis, the affordability metrics have deteriorated by 50%. So it used to be that it cost 2.7 times the average income to buy a house here. Now it's 4 times the average income to buy a house here. Maybe even 4. I can't remember if it was 4.0, 4.2. So we're starting to get like unaffordable housing. Think about how difficult it is to get married and stay married. The marriage rates are falling. Now, divorce has actually gone down, but the divorce rate's still like 40%. It's like if you're like a young person today who wants to get married, like listen to the people talk about dating apps and what it means to date. It's hard. Like life is hard today. Look at like all of our like chronic obesity rates. Look at the opioid and all the drug issues. I think about growing up, again, in Southern Indiana, rural Southern Indiana. Yeah, people killed themselves in drunk driving accidents. But nobody died of opioids because there were no opioids. There were no hard drugs in the community that I grew up in. The number of people who were doing something like heroin would have been minuscule, because now that stuff is pervasive. And so there's so many ways to blow your life up. Oh, when I was a kid, we didn't have sports betting on your phone that could bankrupt you. The world is just full of landmines today. And so if you want to succeed in this world, if you want to even just, make it, you got to elevate your game. We can't just mail it in. It's just like that. I wanted to get into college. So what happened when I'm a senior? I apply to IU, I get in, I go. Like, my generation never had to give much thought to college. And now, like, it's hard to get into IU, even if you're an in-state student. And so, what people do now to get their kids into college, they're planning it out before the kid's even born. And so we just live in a much more competitive, difficult world. And again, this is even far beyond Christianity, but, we need to elevate our game. Evangelicalism has been historically kind of a middle-class movement. And, the middle class has been under a lot of pressure. And so, I think we need to really elevate our game in every aspect of life, cultivating genuine excellence, because the world just has a higher degree of difficulty than it used to.
So I think of especially that book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, that the command to love God with all your heart, soul, your mind, and strength. And sometimes we have forgotten that. And I appreciate so much the movement that I grew up in. Taught me a love for Jesus, a love for the scriptures. But sometimes there would be a little derogatory statement about intelligence or doing deeper study. And I think that God gave us a beautiful world. We should use our mind and we should pursue excellence. And certainly talking with Christopher Teeter, our mutual friend, who will be back on to talk about artificial intelligence, like you throw into all that complexity, what's coming with the revolution around artificial intelligence. So even being excellent, but being excellent at activities and opportunities that could not be replaced by a robot or by artificial intelligence. So I appreciate there can be just this is too much. And we see a generation of young men often withdrawing, like, all right, the dating app's too hard, but just to lean in and to pursue excellence. We know that that's scriptural and biblical.
And I think, I wrote a whole chapter on this one too, is, just being spiritually committed. I think the era in this negative world, the era of sort of the lukewarm, pew warming Christian without too much, obvious and flagrant sin in their lives, that is kind of going to go away. You're going to have, if you're not, while you're reading your Bible, are you praying? Are you attending church? Are you doing these things? It's going to be something where I think, we need to count the cost, as has been said, and consider, right? Are you willing to be all in? Or are you, just going to do it as long as it's sort of comfortable in the thing everybody else in your social network does? So I think there's some things to think about there. Spiritually excellent as well.
Amen. I'm sure the pastor's listening to that. My wife, who's on staff at our church, will often talk about how it seems like church gets the spiritual leftovers, is kind of her comment. And yeah, that's not going to suffice as we move deeper into the negative world. So great topics here. The next one is to pursue institutional integrity. What are your encouragements there?
Sure. And again, I use the term integrity in kind of the ethics sense, but also in the sense of structure, especially in the sense of structural integrity. As the pressure gets higher, are you going to deform under the pressure? Are you going to collapse under the pressure? Like the hull of a ship or the structure of a bridge. And I list this across a number of dimensions. One is, again, the baseline ethics and trustworthiness, right? Are we good stewards of funds? Are we, running our institutions just well with integrity? Trust in institutions is declined a lot, including the church. And the truth is, it should have declined a lot. And the reality is, the Roman Catholic abuse scandals, many of the abuse scandals in evangelical churches, we have not been running our own. We have not run our own ship very well in a lot of cases. And, there are a lot of pastors that, became incredibly rich off of their ministries, maybe even in unseemly ways. So, we have to deal with those things, and stewarding, making sure that we're managing for trust is important. Again, competence is critical. We need to be competent, like excellent people in terms of what we're doing. And, I think, we do a pretty good job, in running churches themselves, I think, pretty competently in a lot of ways. I mean, not perfect, but I mean, we have some like world-class preaching, right? Where people are very good at that. So that's good. We got to be confident. And then lastly, we got to maintain missional integrity. And this is where I think evangelicalism can be weak, because its strength has been its adaptability to cultural change. In essence, evangelicalism really only came into its own as a movement as the mainline denominations basically went into a decline, and they were never able to adapt to changing times. Whereas evangelicalism filled the gaps with the Willow Creeks of this world, and all these different churches came along and they were innovators. And the problem is when you're kind of a cultural innovator and you figure out how to be relevant to the culture, then you just kind of get pulled by the culture in whichever way that it's going. And the question is, can you have like an idea of what your mission is and how to think about it, and how to have integrity around staying on that? And that's not to say that you never change, but you have to think about what is your core. And just like one of the things that happened circa 2015, I started noticing, is right around the time everybody started talking about race in secular society, all of a sudden the church started repeating the same exact talking points, in a slightly variated form. Yeah. And so you start looking at that and it's like, man, the agenda of the church was being set by the world. And I know that like a lot of these pastors, they're hearing it from like, especially from these kind of like these millennials. These millennials would complain, you need to talk more about this. You need to talk more about that. We don't like this. And so that pressure, they're responsive to pressure because, we're all responsive to pressure in some respects. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't talk about this, that, or the other thing. I mean, I think we could talk about anything in a sense, although I encourage people not to get involved in partisan politics from the pulpit. But I think part of it is like when your agenda radically changes, when there's a shift in the culture to sort of mimic that, then I think you got to ask, like, are you really having that integrity, in your mission and thinking about what you're about? And so I think that's like, I think our weakness is that we over adapt. Our strength is that we can adapt. And that's why I feel like, look, there will be a new generation of religious entrepreneurs that create new models of church in the negative world, specific for this. Just as, when the cities came back, we found new ways. When baby boomers hit suburbia, we found ways. The question is, can we do that in ways that, align with like the integrity of the mission that we've laid out? And so that's something I think we want to think about. And then again, the last part of that I'd say is, generational transition. Again, when you have a church built on relevance that's very relevant today, it won't be relevant in 20 years. Right. And so you see this, you see it in Indiana. The older mega churches aren't as hot anymore. They've lost some people. And then there's the new generation with like the models that are dialed in to like today's preferences. And a lot of churches, are facing leadership transitions from their founding pastors. And, that's a very fraught time. And so I think, being able to sustain something, not just have it go and be very successful for even like 2 or 3 decades. But what happens when that, superstar founding pastor retires? Or when times really change. And so I think this is one that's, that is also going to be something that, over optimizing for a particular moment in time makes it hard to sustain for the long term. And so we need to think about how we become multi-generational. A lot of people like to give mainline churches grief. And I'm like, you do realize a lot of these churches have been around 150 plus years, right? You're looking at them, the ones that you make fun of today had, many of them are still faithful, but, a lot of them like had, 3x as much faithful time of ministry as your church has had today. Call me when you're 150 years old and see if your church even exists. Will you even exist, much less be doing anything of anything? So I think we got to think about that.
There's so much there. And just briefly, that structural integrity is an issue that I stumbled into in 2015 when the Obergefell versus Hodges decision came down, making same-sex marriage the law of the land. So many calls from churches. And as we jumped in, of course, the request was essentially help protect us from external pressure. But when we dug into documents and into church leadership structure, it was very clear that they were very susceptible to internal division. And you think about what's happened in groups like the United Methodist Church, the strain that you see in other denominations, and how many churches have split internally. That was certainly something that's on our radar. It's pretty flashy to go out and litigate religious defense cases, but if our churches don't have that strong leadership model, then yeah, you're never going to make that 150-year mark. And then I love that thought of, our strength is adaptability, but it's also can be our weakness. And we see some churches that I think are doing that well, focusing back in on disciple making, focusing in on reaching the culture, but standing for truth. But then we see some, and I've been increasingly troubled by some of the things I see coming from Andy Stanley and some of the language that he's been using. It's like you've adapted so far that you've gone away from Scripture. So that's a good warning for us.
One of the things this isn't a very popular thing to say, in many circles, but if you're in a negative world, I think you have to recognize, that, you're in a minority position in society. And when you're a minority, you need to shift to a minority mindset. And that doesn't mean a negative or hostile attitude towards the majority, but you just got to realize, hey, what the rest of society is doing is not what we're doing. And this is what minorities have had to do in America for a long time. And so I encourage people to look at, for example, early 20th century Catholicism as a model when we really were, pre-war America was really pretty anti-Catholic country. What was it like to live, as a faithful Catholic in 1920 or something like that? They had to build a lot of infrastructure for that. And the other thing is, I say, I think evangelicals need to be a lot less interested in what other people are doing and a lot more interested in what they're doing. Because I think part of it is when you look, I read Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. He's an Atlantic reporter. His father was a, evangelical pastor. He says he's an evangelical himself, even. And, he wrote this book basically trashing, evangelicals that voted for Trump. And I think there's a lot in that book you could say that he got wrong. But you go look at the litany of, churches behaving badly that he lists in there. And I think, even if you don't agree with this guy's entire approach, we have to recognize that there are a lot of issues that we need to clean up internally. We're weak. As you say, we're internally divided. And just the fact that so many churches had these big rifts over COVID. That's why I always like to say, let's take it out of the realm of some of these flashpoint culture war issues. Just like COVID, churches were just it was like massive divisions, lots of resorting of people, over that issue. And so they really weren't as unified as they thought on a lot of points. And so, I think in the future, Christians are going to have to be much more concerned about their own communities and, much less motivated about figuring out how to change the world to map to their preferred outcomes. And I think that's just reality. And it doesn't mean that, there's anything intrinsically wrong about that. But the truth is the cultural conditions are different at different times. In the New Testament church, and this is one of the things that really strikes me, if you read the letters of Paul, he is remarkably unconcerned about what the Roman Empire is up to. He's overwhelmingly concerned about what people in the church are doing. He's worried about personal holiness, unity in the church, things of that nature. He actually issues remarkably few commands about the church, the world outside the church. And most of what he did was basically about how to accommodate yourself to it with the least disruption. Pay taxes to whom taxes are due. So far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Because the church was very small and it wasn't liked and it had a lot of internal problems. And so that's what he's focusing on. Later, as the Roman Empire Christianized, all of a sudden, things started to be restructured in the Roman Empire to, align with, Christian values. There was a movement to abolish slavery, for example, because you now had, it wasn't like you're this small group of people under an emperor who might kill you if you act up. Now all of a sudden you're the majority and your values are dominant and you can start affecting society in a different sort of way. And so I think that we do have to be attuned to where we are. Again, Ecclesiastes talks about, the famous, there's a time for this, there's a time for that. And we just have to understand that like the actual approaches we take cannot be the same in every single time. So I think this is a time in which we need to be focused internally more so than externally. That doesn't mean give up on evangelization or something like that. I'm not saying that. Or even political engagement. But the balance needs to be shifted more to the internal, less to the external, while at the same time, I think very critically, not like overstating reality. As I always say, we are not experiencing persecution in the United States in the way that the church in China is experiencing persecution, or the way that Nigerian Christians are being victims of sectarian violence. So we shouldn't minimize the reality, but we shouldn't overstate it either, and we shouldn't develop a victim complex about it. And so I think that's a tough balance to get right, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about things.
And so you talked some there about kind of pursuing community strength and focusing internally. And then you have two others. We'll just go through them pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Be a light and then be prudentially engaged. What was your encouragement there?
Yeah. So in terms of being a light, a little bit, it's a little bit that my work actually I got interested in writing about religious issues because I saw the rise of secular men's influencers. This was over a decade ago, who were all these young men, middle-aged men even, turning to online influencers for life guidance and not to the church. And that was very hard to explain to people in 2014. It's very easy today because I can just say Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, many of these people. Although, amazingly, the majority of evangelicals have never heard of Andrew Tate, somebody who is the single dominant influence on men under the age of 22 and teenage boys in the United States of America. If you don't know who Andrew Tate is, Google him. 80% of British 16 and 17-year-olds had been watching his content. 80%. Wow. And it's probably like that high in the United States. And we don't even know who he is. And we're not competitive. Like, I just went to the Jordan Peterson We Who Wrestle with God tour in downtown Indianapolis. Murat Theater, 2,500 seats. Cheapest one in there is over $100. Sold out. Listening to him give a sermon on Genesis 12. I'm like, people are paying that guy hundreds of dollars to hear him give sermons. So, like, why have people turned to them but not us? Huh. And, one of the things as I was studying this, and we don't have time to go into this today, but I realized, one of the things that kind of made him famous was his willingness to speak very clearly on issues in ways that went against the sort of the secular ideologies, but without being like a gratuitous provocateur about it. Now, he's taken a more aggressively political turn as of late, but I would highly recommend everyone go to YouTube and watch his 30-minute interview on the UK's Channel 4 from 2018. Jordan Peterson, Channel 4, where he sits there in front of this very hostile female interviewer and just holds his frame and, dare I say, winsomely articulates various facts. Like, hey, when you look at the big 5 personality traits, it's empirically the case that women on average score higher on agreeableness than men. And here are some consequences of that. And of course, this woman doesn't want to hear that. But like, he's sitting here saying stuff. He's saying things that are true. And so, I'll just give one example, and just give you an example of why we need to be better. You listen to what people in the church are telling you about, like, how to get married and like how to have a successful like relationship and all that. A lot of it's just not true. There's this one very famous pastor who wrote this piece one time, which I keep coming back to. He said, "I keep saying it, people. Godliness is sexy to godly people." So it's the whole godliness is sexy paradigm. What does Jordan Peterson say? Jordan Peterson in 12 Rules for Life wrote, "Girls are attracted to boys who win status contests with other boys." Like, isn't that pretty obvious that that's actually the case? You think back to high school. Just think back to high school. That's why, John Cougar Mellencamp did that song, Play Guitar. If you go listen to that, like, all you have to do is just anything. And so we have to be speaking truth about a lot of things, not in a bomb throwing way, but just being clear, because people today, young people today, there's so much like suffering among young people, mental illness in Generation Z and frustration over can't find anyone to date. There's dating barriers. We have to be the source of, we need to be the light that's like telling people, here's how you can navigate that, right? If you want, here's how we can show you how to get married and have a healthy marriage and a sustainable family. And we need to be the people telling them that, not Jordan Peterson and certainly not Andrew Tate, And so that's one, I think one of the things I do. And the world is like telling them things like, polyamory is great. And most likely that's not going to be something that's going to be great for you. And in fact, most of these articles about it kind of make clear it typically goes awry. Yeah. So I think we need to, they're out there repping everything. There's a whole bunch of messages coming in. We need to have the better messages. And so we need to be clear, but not necessarily like the bomb throwing culture war styles. It's like, here's how the world works and how we can, guide people into the safe harbor. And of course, speaking the gospel is part of that, being clear on what we teach there. So I think those are important things to get right.
I want to tie something back to something you said previously about the church just responding to cultural norms, or the culture wants to talk about a particular moral issue, and then the church talks about it. And what I see in Scripture is the church is to be that moral voice. It's the pillar in the ground of the truth. We should be leading that moral conversation. And what I sense at times, I felt it in my own heart as well, it's just kind of a hesitancy, a defensiveness, and perhaps because cultural change has happened so quickly, we're still as a movement trying to find our footing. But what I'd love to see is the church just leading out, just being confident. Hey, we have the answer. It's both true and good, good for us, good for all people. And like you said with Peterson, just, hey, biblical marriage between a man and a woman is what leads to success. Just look at the stats. It's best for children. Look at the stats. And I see a lot of kind of backstepping, sensitivity, caution about, what we believe is actually true. And the world's looking for answers, and these other people are providing it. So I just thought that was a great encouragement, certainly to those that are filling our pulpits every Sunday, but for us in our spheres of influence too. The last one, just briefly, just talking about prudential engagement. And part of this that I wanted to focus on was you engage prudentially, but then that leaves some room for your fellow Christian, those that believe in biblical sexual ethic or conservative principles, that leaves some room for them to also engage prudentially without just canceling them. And so I saw you wrote a little bit on this recently. Would you dig into that?
Well, I think that, what I'm saying is I think there's kind of two views in the evangelical church that I see today. The view number one is we need to double down on culture war. And there seems to be an implicit and sometimes explicit view that, the real reason the culture war failed is because Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed, they didn't fight hard enough. And you sometimes see this in the appeal of Trumpism. He fights as mean and nasty as they do, right? He plays to win. And what we really need to do is start playing to win. And that's the reason why it didn't work in the previous ones. And then the other one is sort of this, kind of Anabaptist inflected call to essentially disengage, I might say selectively disengage from, any sort of controversial activism whatsoever. And you often hear this, it's rarely phrased quite that way, but you hear things like, we're not citizens of the United States of America, we're citizens in heaven. Or, we're just sojourners and exiles here, or we lose down here. That's my favorite one. It's like, we lose down here. So, basically the whole idea is like, essentially just, surrender. And I think, the truth probably lies somewhere between those, where you can't just, withdraw, can't go hide in a backwoods bubble. At the same time, you need to be attuned to political realities, which is that much of what American conservative Christians want is unpopular, and you cannot conflate the electoral prospects of the Republican Party with essentially the status of Christianity or the popularity of social conservative views. Those are two different things. We are headed in the United States, as has been the case in many European countries for a while, towards a post-Christian right. I mean, if you go look at some of the populist right parties in Europe, many of them are, secularist in the way that they operate. And I think, Donald Trump, in a sense, represents the first kind of steps, in those directions. His real issues really were not, social conservatism is understood. He's like, I want to talk about immigration, trade, things of that nature. Again, I'm just seeing on Twitter right before we came in to record this about how, they're taking anti-abortion stuff out of the Republican platform. And realistically, that stuff is going to happen. Why? Because, opposition to abortion is electorally unpopular, and there is no donor constituency that wants it. And so these politicians who just want to go where the votes are, they're just responding to those market forces. And so what do you do in that situation? I don't know. I'm not telling you what to do, but that's just the realities that we sort of find ourselves in. And so thinking about what it means to engage in a wise manner is something that has to be done. And I think it's one in which many people are going to come to various disagreements. People aren't always going to alight on the same solution. But I think we ought to recognize that different people might come to different good faith conclusions about what to do and try to be, as understanding as possible on that basis.
So what you described is where I live most days. And so I mentioned a name earlier, Andy Stanley. So just put a little context there. Certainly the concern I have of kind of unhitching the New from the Old Testament, some of the issues surrounding the biblical sexual ethic. But I, even recently, especially as we're in election season, I get a lot of conversation, a lot of requests about his book, Not In It to Win It, which is along the lines of we lose down here. Let's not engage beyond loving our neighbor. So very disengaged approach versus a book like Eric Metaxas's Letter to the American Church. And so you're getting these all the time.
I don't know really much about Andy Stanley, to tell you the truth, but I do know that the people who talk about, we lose down here are people who tend to be big winners down here. These are people with gigantic mega churches and incredibly successful ministries and people in, wow, they're not losing. They don't intend to personally lose. They're quite motivated to continue winning in what they're doing. So, yeah, I think it's it's like the billionaire saying, money doesn't really matter. There is a sense in which, maybe that's true. I think there's a sense we can know that's true. On the other hand, it's like, not the most credible messenger.
So I appreciate that encouragement. Where we land is it's a stewardship principle. God in His providence has placed us in the United States of America. We have citizenship. We have an opportunity to engage and to make a difference. So that's kind of where we landed the VIX of those. So I was just kind of chuckling internally, like, yeah, this is pretty much every day for me. Yeah. So want to be conscious. I'm
sure you're hearing it. Yes, when you're, and of course you're like an advocacy organization essentially. And so, when you're in that vote, you can't, that's sort of your raison d'etre in a way. So that's not true of most people.
Sure. So want to be conscious of your time. There's so many things we could jump into, but you did speak recently into this question of how can a declining America get back on track? And even in recent conversations with pastors, other Christians, there's a lot of, well, we're in a declining empire. The words that might be used, our best days are behind us. And this has been a common theme throughout American history, but I do sense that we're in a very troubled state. So in the conversation or the work that you were doing is thinking through what could be some steps that America could take to get back on track. And so I appreciate your thoughts there.
Well, I wouldn't just extrapolate the worst of current trends into the future. So, we had very tremendous social upheavals in the 60s and 70s. The 70s were a very bad decade economically. We had stagflation, lines at the gas station, all that stuff. You could easily have said, circa 1976, of course, Watergate, Nixon resignation. We could have said that America was done. You might well have argued that it was America, not the Soviet Union, that was, going to collapse. But of course, it didn't work out that way. And so, we do have a lot of challenges now. I mean, look, when we have declining life expectancy, mass opioid deaths, you go through the list, there's a lot of problems. At the same time, we're still the epicenter of world technology. We still have untold millions of people who are looking to come here. I was just reading in the Financial Times about the fact that record numbers of millionaires and billionaires are trying to get out of China. I mean, China's own highly successful citizens are trying to leave the country, or at least get a lot of their wealth out of it. We don't see that here. You don't see mass abandonment of America. You're not expatriating to some other country. And there are people here and there that do that. Rod Dreher wrote The Benedict Option, now lives in Hungary. There's always been people who lived in foreign countries. I'm not saying America's never lived. There's a lot of American retirees in Mexico. But we're not seeing this abandonment of America, nor are we seeing any decline in the number of people who are, chomping at the bit to get in here. And so there's still a lot of opportunity in America. And, we have, believe me, I could give a million reasons why things are not going well. But I think we would make a mistake in thinking that we're not going to be able to fix it. Maybe we won't. Maybe we will collapse. But in fact, when you look at the Civil War, certainly a worse time for America, the Depression, World War II, these are genuinely existential matters for the United States. And we found the ability to step up and do what was needed to transform. And so I think we certainly have the potential to do that again. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm not super excited by our choices of president this year, for example. But I think much like in the 1970s, I think there is a growing consensus that things need to be fixed. It was Jimmy Carter who started the deregulation push, continued by Reagan. People knew we needed to do some deregulating in the 1970s. Well, today you have center-left scholars like Richard Reeves talking about, here's the problems facing boys and men. Melissa Carney writing books about the two-parent privilege, and hey, two-parent families are critical. So people like that are now talking about these problems. And I think there's some understanding there. So I don't know. I don't have a policy prescription and everything, but I think projecting catastrophe, has always kind of not been a winning bet in America. And so that's why I say I'm still long the US of A right now. But that's what I'd say.
That's encouraging. And my next project, one of my next projects I'm going to be working on is how do we encourage, especially as podcast goes out primarily to church leaders, committed Christians, among that group of people, I sense a real malaise, a real discouragement. Oh, we still have great opportunity. The more you read about American history, every generation thought it was the end of America.
Right.
It's this is good. We're going to, and it's actually been that dissatisfaction. Let's continue building. That's always, I think, been a part of the American genius. So let's keep at it. Let's not be the generation that disengages. So
and America's it's a protean nation. We're always changing, transforming, and we're going to keep doing it most likely.
It's encouraged me, and so I wanted to bring that to the audience as well.
Well, here's I'll leave you with this. This will be my last comment, which is, I think a lot of American Christians like to assume that if things go south for Christianity, that means America is done. It's over for America. I don't think those things are as linked as some people might want them to. And so the idea is, I think we could go on for a good long time as a viable, civic enterprise in America, even if Christianity here fades a lot, just as European countries have done. So I think I do think we need to de-link these ideas a little bit in our mind.
I think that could help with, let's be faithful in the church. I do think the church being faithful, teaching those Judeo-Christian principles, that's the foundation of our republic. But I think there's some releasing it to, we can do what we can do, and then we've got to give kind of history to God and be confident in that. So last question I had for you, and this has been a very thought-provoking, encouraging conversation. If you had a billboard on which to put a message to the broader church today, what would you put on it?
Good question. Fear not. How about that?
Okay. That's a consistent command in Scripture, and one that if I remember correctly, that command is replicated something like 365 times.
Yeah.
So like once
it would fit on a billboard. That's what I put.
Absolutely. Well, Aaron, I appreciate your work. We will link to the Substack as well as to the book and other pieces of your work, the review by DeYoung as well. So thank you for taking some time with us today and encourage us living out our faith courageously, faithfully in the negative world.